The evening sun cast long shadows through the airport's glass windows as Lieutenant Amara Wilson stood at the check-in counter, her military uniform crisp despite the 20-hour journey from Afghanistan. Her shoulders felt heavy, not from her compact military backpack, but from the weight of her third tour of duty. She had been dreaming of this moment, heading home to surprise her mom, and had saved up her airline miles specifically for a comfortable first-class seat. "I'm sorry, but first class is fully booked," said the airline representative, barely glancing at her computer screen. Her badge read Linda, and she wore a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Amara took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. She had learned patience in the military, where she served as a combat medic, saving countless lives under impossible conditions. "Could you double-check, please? My app shows several available seats, and I have more than enough miles for the upgrade." Linda's fingers moved lazily across the keyboard. "As I said, we're fully booked." Just then, a businessman in a gray suit approached the counter next to them. Within minutes, he was walking away with a first-class upgrade, his boarding pass held triumphantly in hand. Amara felt her throat tighten, but years of military discipline kept her voice steady. "Ma'am, I couldn't help but notice that gentleman just received an upgrade. Could you explain the discrepancy?" The representative's smile thinned. "Perhaps you misunderstood. Those seats are reserved for our premium members." Pulling out her phone, Amara opened her airline app, displaying her Platinum Elite status, earned through countless flights for military service. Other passengers began to notice the exchange, some slowing their pace to watch, others pretending not to see what was unfolding. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing at Amara's combat medals. "Mom, look, she's a soldier." His mother quickly shushed him, but not before several nearby passengers turned to look. The growing attention seemed to make Linda uncomfortable. She called over a senior flight attendant, a woman with steel gray hair who introduced herself as Mrs. Harrison. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone suggesting she had already decided there was. "No problem," Amara replied calmly, though her heart was racing. "I'm just trying to understand why my upgrade request is being denied when I meet all the requirements, and others are being upgraded right in front of me." Mrs. Harrison's eyes narrowed. "May I see your military ID and frequent flyer credentials?" The way she asked made it sound less like a question and more like a challenge. As Amara reached for her documents, she caught her reflection in the counter's glass surface. She saw her father in her own eyes, the same determined look he used to get when facing obstacles. She had never used his name or legacy for special treatment, just as he had taught her. But standing there, being treated like a second-class citizen despite her service to her country, she felt both his strength and his pain. What happened next would change not just her journey home, but the lives of many others who had faced similar treatment in silence. Outside, the sun continued to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Unaware that inside Terminal C, a moment of everyday discrimination was about to transform into something much more significant. Just down the corridor from where Amara stood dealing with the flight situation, a small crowd gathered in the airport's aviation history wing. The walls were lined with photographs of pioneering pilots, their faces telling stories of determination and courage. At the center of attention was a striking black and white photograph of a man in a pilot's uniform, his smile confident yet humble. "And here we have one of our most remarkable stories," said Mr. Thompson, a retired pilot who now volunteered as a museum guide. His eyes lit up as he gestured toward the photograph. "Alexander Wilson, photographed here in 1964, changed the face of commercial aviation forever." A little girl at the front of the group raised her hand. Was it hard for him to become a pilot? The innocence of her question brought a gentle smile to Mr. Thompson's weathered face. "It wasn't just hard, sweetheart. It was nearly impossible," he replied, his voice soft but carrying weight. "Back then, many people didn't want to see a black man in the cockpit. But Alexander had a dream, and more importantly, he had the skill to back it up. The group leaned in closer as Mr. Thompson continued. He learned to fly in the military, serving our country when many places back home still had segregated water fountains. After the service, no commercial airline would hire him. Not because he lacked ability, but because of the color of his skin. A teenager in the group, clutching his phone but now completely absorbed in the story, spoke up. So what did he do? Mr. Thompson's eyes twinkled. He kept applying. Every rejection made him more determined. He studied harder, flew better, and eventually, one airline couldn't ignore his perfect test scores and outstanding military record. But getting hired was just the beginning. He walked closer to the photograph, pointing out details in the background. See that coffee cup on his desk? He used to say that cup saw more drama than most action movies. Some passengers would refuse to fly with him. Other pilots wouldn't sit with him in the break room. But he just kept showing up, doing his job with excellence. A woman in a business suit checked her watch but didn't leave, caught up in the story. Mr. Thompson noticed and smiled. Don't worry, the best part's coming up. Alexander didn't just break barriers for himself. Once he became a captain, he started a mentoring program. He worked extra hours, unpaid, to help other minority pilots navigate the system. He always said, the first one through the door has to hold it open for others. The group had grown larger now, with passing travelers stopping to listen. By the time he retired, he had helped hundreds of pilots get their wings. But here's what made him truly special. He did it all quietly, without fanfare. He believed actions spoke louder than words. Mr. Thompson paused, looking at each face in the crowd. And you know what? The airline that finally hired him. They later named their pilot training center after him. The same people who had once refused to even interview him ended up honoring him as a legend. A young boy pointed at another photo, one showing Alexander in his later years, surrounded by a diverse group of pilots. Are those all the people he helped? Just some of them. Mr. Thompson chuckled. His legacy lives on today. Every time you see a diverse flight crew, remember Alexander Wilson and others like him who didn't just dream of change. They created it, one flight at a time. As the group began to disperse, an elderly couple lingered, studying the photograph. The woman wiped a tear from her eye. We flew with him once, she said softly. Smoothest landing I've ever experienced. When we saw him in his uniform at the door, my husband said, now that's what progress looks like. Little did anyone in the museum know that just a few hundred feet away, Alexander Wilson's legacy was about to become more relevant than ever, as his own daughter faced a battle he had fought decades ago. Back at the check-in counter, the situation was getting tenser by the minute. A small crowd had gathered, trying to look busy with their phones while secretly watching the scene unfold. Amara stood straight, her military training evident in her posture, as she faced both Linda and Mrs. Harrison. I need to see those documents again, Mrs. Harrison said, adjusting her glasses as if the first 3 times she checked weren't enough. Her fingernails tapped against the counter in an irritating rhythm. A young woman nearby had started recording with her phone, trying to be subtle but not quite succeeding. An older gentleman in a business suit shook his head and muttered, "This isn't right," just loud enough for others to hear. "Ma'am," Amara said, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used when treating wounded soldiers under fire. "I've shown you my military ID, my platinum status card, and my flight records. I'm simply requesting the same upgrade consideration that other passengers are receiving." Just then, another passenger walked up to the counter next to them. Without even asking, Linda processed his upgrade to first class. He was in and out in less than 2 minutes. The crowd's murmuring grew louder. A college student wearing headphones took them off and spoke up. "Hey, how come he got an upgrade so fast?" Mrs. Harrison shot him a sharp look. "This is a private matter, sir." "Is it?" called out another voice from the growing crowd. Because it looks pretty public to me. Amara raised her hand slightly, trying to calm the situation. I appreciate everyone's concern, but I'd like to handle this professionally. Her words carried the weight of someone who'd faced much worse situations than this. A mother with 2 small children stepped forward. My kids and I watched you help an elderly couple with their bags earlier while we were waiting in line. You're clearly one of the good ones, someone who serves others. This treatment isn't fair. The young woman who had been recording spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. I'm going to post this online. People need to see this is still happening in 2024. Mrs. Harrison's face paled slightly at those words. She leaned in closer to Linda, whispering something urgently. Linda's fingers suddenly became very busy on her keyboard. Look, Amara said, keeping her voice steady, I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just completed my 3rd tour, treating wounded soldiers regardless of their race, rank, or background. All I'm asking for is fair treatment in return. An elderly man in a veteran's cap stood up from his wheelchair. I fought in Vietnam, he announced, his voice carrying across the terminal. And I'm seeing the same garbage now that I saw back then. When will we learn? The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other airline staff began to notice the commotion, throwing concerned glances their way. A security guard approached but stayed at a distance, sensing this was more complicated than a typical airport dispute. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding, Mrs. Harrison said, her tone suddenly softer. Let me check the system again. No misunderstanding, said a new voice, deep and authoritative. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. A tall man in a pilot's uniform was walking towards them, his captain's stripes gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He moved with the confidence of someone who had seen this scene before, maybe too many times. The crowd parted like water as he approached, and even Mrs. Harrison straightened up. Something about his presence suggested this story was about to take an unexpected turn. I think, he said, looking directly at Amara's name tag and then at the staff, we need to talk about Alexander Wilson's daughter. The silence that followed was deafening. Captain Robert Chen moved through the gathered crowd with purpose, his 30 years of flight experience visible in every step. His eyes were fixed on Amara's name tag, and a mix of emotion crossed his weathered face. I flew with your father, he said, his voice carrying both warmth and authority. First officer under him back in '89. Best pilot I've ever known, and I've known plenty. The atmosphere in the terminal shifted instantly. Linda's fingers froze over her keyboard. Mrs. Harrison's stern expression cracked slightly. The onlookers, who moments ago were recording a scene of discrimination, now found themselves witnessing something entirely different. Alexander Wilson, Captain Chen continued, turning to face the airline staff, taught me everything I know about grace under pressure. And right now, his daughter is showing that same grace. He smiled at Amara. Though I'm sure he never told you about saving our entire crew during that storm over Denver. Amara's eyes whitened slightly. He didn't talk much about his flying days at home, she said softly. Always said actions speak louder than words. That sounds just like him. Captain Chen chuckled, then grew serious. You know, that night over Denver, we lost 2 engines in the worst turbulence I'd ever seen. Your father remained so calm, you'd think we were on a Sunday drive. He landed that plane like it was the easiest thing in the world. Saved 219 lives that night. A young boy in the crowd gasped. His mother hushed him, but she too was leaning in to hear more. But here's what really tells you about Alexander Wilson, Captain Chen continued. The next day, when the newspapers came running for interviews, he refused to be photographed alone. Insisted on standing with the entire crew. Said every safe landing was a team effort. Mrs. Harrison shifted uncomfortably. Captain Chen, I had no idea. Of course you didn't, he said kindly. That's how Alexander wanted it. He never broadcasted who he was. But those of us who knew him, we remember. We remember how he changed things from the inside out. The captain reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he carefully removed a worn photograph. "Always carry this with me," he said, showing it to the gathered crowd. It showed a younger version of himself standing next to Alexander Wilson, both in pilot uniforms, smiling broadly. "This was taken the day he endorsed me for captain," Captain Chen explained. Back then, there weren't many Asian pilots in command positions either. Alexander didn't just break barriers for himself, he broke them for all of us. The young woman who had been recording earlier lowered her phone, wiping tears from her eyes. The elderly veteran in his wheelchair nodded slowly, a look of understanding passing between him and the captain. "Now," Captain Chen said, turning back to the counter, "about that upgrade situation." His tone was friendly, but left no room for argument. "I believe we have a chance here to honor a legacy. What do you say?" Linda's fingers were already moving across the keyboard, this time with purpose. Mrs. Harrison straightened her uniform jacket. "Of course, Captain. We'll take care of it right away." But Amara raised her hand. "With respect, sir," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I don't want special treatment because of who my father was. That's not what he stood for." Captain Chen's smile grew wider. "No, it's not. He stood for equal treatment for everyone. So how about we start with that?" He turned to the airline staff. "Maybe it's time to review those upgrade protocols, ensure everyone's getting a fair shot." The crowd murmured in agreement. A few people started clapping softly. Through the terminal's large windows, the setting sun cast a golden light across everyone's faces, as if nature itself was highlighting a moment of change. Word spread through Terminal C like wildfire. The story of Alexander Wilson's daughter, a combat medic who'd saved countless lives overseas, being denied an upgrade, began reaching different corners of the airport. Passengers waiting at nearby gates started sharing the story on their phones, some pulling up old articles about the legendary pilot. "I remember reading about him in flight school," a young pilot in training said to her friend, showing an article on her tablet. "Alexander Wilson wasn't just any pilot. He was the one who started the mentorship program that helped me get my wings." At the counter, things had changed dramatically. The same staff members who had been dismissive now couldn't move fast enough to help. Linda's fingers flew across the keyboard, her earlier reluctance replaced by nervous energy. "I've found an article about your father," a teenager said, approaching Amara with his phone. "It says he flew for 32 years without a single incident. That's incredible." His mother stood nearby, nodding encouragingly. Captain Chen smiled. "That's not even the half of it," he said. "Let me tell you about the time he landed a plane during an ice storm when every other flight was grounded." But first, he turned to Mrs. Harrison. "I think we need to address the bigger picture here." Mrs. Harrison nodded, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Yes, of course. We clearly need to review our upgrade protocols. This isn't what our airline stands for." An older flight attendant who had been watching from a distance stepped forward. "I flew with Alexander Wilson back in '85, she said softly. "He was the first pilot who treated us all like equals, regardless of our background. Used to say that everyone on his crew was family." More airport staff gathered around, drawn by the growing crowd and the mentions of Alexander Wilson's name. A ground crew member in his fluorescent vest spoke up. "My uncle used to work maintenance on his flights. Said Mr. Wilson always knew every crew member's name, from the cockpit to the tarmac." Amara stood quietly, taking it all in. She'd grown up hearing bits and pieces about her father's career, but he'd always been humble about his achievements. Now, surrounded by strangers sharing their stories, she was discovering new dimensions of his legacy. "Your father changed things without making a fuss," a senior gate agent said, joining the conversation. "He didn't protest or shout. He just showed up every day, did his job better than anyone else, and helped others along the way. The young woman who had been recording earlier raised her hand. I've already gotten responses to my video. People are sharing similar stories from other airports, other airlines. This isn't just about one upgrade denial, it's about a pattern. Captain Chen nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly what Alexander would focus on, the system, not the symptom. He didn't just want to fix one incident, he wanted to prevent the next one. A customer service supervisor hurried over, having been alerted to the situation. I've just gotten off the phone with our regional director, she announced. They want to issue an immediate statement and begin a review of our upgrade policies across all terminals. Look at that, the elderly veteran said from his wheelchair. Your father's still creating change, even now. Amara finally spoke, her voice steady but emotional. My father used to tell me that real change doesn't come from big gestures. It comes from small moments when people choose to do better, to be better. The crowd murmured in agreement. Parents were explaining the situation to their children. Business travelers had put away their laptops to listen. Even the hurried passengers rushing to their gates slowed down, sensing they were witnessing something important. The story of what was happening in Terminal C began reaching other parts of the airport. Pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew members started sharing their own memories of Alexander Wilson. Each story painted a picture of a man who had changed aviation not through dramatic confrontations, but through quiet, persistent excellence. The energy at the counter had completely transformed. Linda, who had earlier claimed no first-class seats were available, was now practically falling over herself to help. I've found several options for you, she said, her voice carrying a nervous tremor. Window or aisle preference? Mrs. Harrison jumped in. We can also upgrade you on your return flight, of course. At no additional cost. Her earlier stern demeanor had melted away entirely. Amara watched this dramatic shift with a mixture of emotions playing across her face. She'd seen this before. People changing their behavior once they realized who her father was. It always left a bittersweet taste in her mouth. A young flight attendant approached with a fresh cup of coffee. I heard you just finished your third tour, she said kindly. You must be exhausted. Please, take this while they sort out your seat. The computer system must have had a glitch earlier, Linda explained weakly, not meeting anyone's eyes. Sometimes these things happen. An older passenger in the crowd couldn't pull back anymore. A glitch? That's what you're calling it. We all saw what happened here. Captain Chen raised his hand calmly. What matters now isn't pointing fingers. It's what we do next. He turned to the airline staff. You have a chance here to turn this into a teaching moment. The customer service supervisor nodded eagerly. Yes, absolutely. In fact, I've just received approval to implement immediate sensitivity training for all frontline staff. We could start as soon as next week. A younger gate agent who had been watching everything unfold spoke up. Could we maybe name the training program after Mr. Wilson? Make it part of his legacy. The crowd's murmuring grew more positive. People were nodding, some taking notes on their phones. A business traveler in an expensive suit spoke up. I'm on this route every week. I've seen computer glitches happen to other passengers too. Maybe it's time for some real changes. Mrs. Harrison smoothed her uniform nervously. We could review all upgrade denials from the past year. Look for patterns. Make sure this doesn't happen again. See, Captain Chen said softly to Amara. Your father's way is still working. Change doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from making people want to be better. A teenage girl who had been quietly watching everything turned to her mother. Mom, is this what they mean by privilege? How everything changed once they knew about her dad? Her mother nodded. Yes, honey. But the real question is, why should anyone need a famous parent to be treated fairly? Amara listened to all of this, still standing straight in her military uniform. Finally, she spoke. I appreciate everyone trying to make this right, but throwing special treatment at me now doesn't fix the underlying problem. My father wouldn't want that. The supervisor stepped forward. What would you suggest? Well, Amara said thoughtfully, instead of just upgrading me, why not review how these decisions are made? Create clear guidelines that are applied equally to everyone. My father always said that real change comes from fixing systems, not making exceptions. Linda, still at her computer, looked up. We could start by making the upgrade criteria completely transparent. Post them where everyone can see them. And train staff to apply them consistently, added another gate agent. Maybe add a review process, suggested someone in the crowd. The energy in the terminal had shifted from anger to something more constructive. People were no longer just watching a scene unfold. They were witnessing positive change in action. Your father would be proud, Captain Chen said quietly to Amara. Not because they're offering you an upgrade now, but because you're using this moment exactly as he would have, to make things better for everyone. The setting sun through the terminal windows cast long shadows across the floor, but the atmosphere was anything but dark. Something that had started as an all-too-familiar scene of discrimination was transforming into a moment of genuine change, one small step at a time. Amara stood quietly at the counter, watching as the airline staff scrambled to make things right. A first-class boarding pass now lay in front of her, but she hadn't picked it up yet. Her mind was racing, thinking about all the others who had faced similar treatment, but didn't have a famous father's name to change the situation. Is everything all right with the seat assignment? Linda asked nervously, noticing Amara's hesitation. Amara looked at the boarding pass, then at the crowd that had gathered, and finally at Captain Chen. You know, she said slowly, I keep thinking about something my father told me when I was little. The terminal grew quieter as people leaned in to listen. Even the usual airport announcements seemed muted. He said that sometimes life gives you a choice. You can either take the easy path that helps just you, or the harder path that might help many. She picked up the boarding pass, turning it over in her hands. Right now, I'm standing at that crossroads. An older woman in the crowd spoke up. Honey, after 3 tours of duty, you deserve that upgrade. Take it and rest. But Captain Chen was watching Amara with understanding in his eyes. You're thinking about the bigger picture, aren't you? Just like your father would. Amara nodded. When I was in Afghanistan, I treated everyone who came into my medical tent equally. American, Afghan, civilian, soldier. Because that's what was right. And that's what my father taught me. Doing what's right isn't always about taking what's offered. She turned to the customer service supervisor. Instead of this upgrade, I have a different request. Could we talk about creating a real, lasting change in how these situations are handled? The supervisor straightened up. What did you have in mind? Well, Amara said, her voice growing stronger. What if we documented everything that happened here today? Not to punish anyone, but to learn from it. To create a training program that helps staff recognize their unconscious biases. The young woman who had been recording earlier raised her hand. I could share the video. Show how the situation changed once they knew about your father. It really highlights the problem. A businessman in the crowd nodded. I'm on the board of a corporate consulting firm. We could help develop the training materials, pro bono. Make it something other airlines could use too. Captain Chen smiled proudly. Now that's Alexander Wilson's daughter talking. He never took the easy path either. Mrs. Harrison, who had been quiet for a while, stepped forward. I've been with this airline for 23 years, she said, her voice shaking slightly. And I've never, I didn't think She took a deep breath. Maybe I need this training as much as anyone. A young gate agent who had been listening spoke up. Could we make it mandatory for everyone? Not just counter staff, but supervisors, managers, everyone. The crowd started buzzing with ideas. Someone suggested creating an anonymous reporting system for passengers who experience discrimination. Another person proposed regular audits of upgrade decisions to check for patterns of bias. Amara listened to it all, still holding the boarding pass. A tear rolled down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. My father would say this is how real change happens, not through one person getting special treatment, but through people working together to fix the system. The elderly veteran wheeled closer. You know what, soldier? Your father broke barriers in the sky. Now you're breaking them on the ground. Different uniform, same fight. Captain Chen placed a gentle hand on Amara's shoulder. The question is, are you ready for this fight? It would be easier to just take that upgrade and get some rest. Amara looked at the boarding pass one last time, then handed it back to Linda. Sometimes the right path isn't the easy one, she said firmly. Let's make sure the next soldier, or teacher, or parent who stands at this counter gets fair treatment without needing a famous last name. The terminal had grown darker as evening settled in, but there was a feeling of dawn in the air, the sense that something new was beginning. Instead of accepting special treatment, Amara spent the next hour working with the airline staff, turning a moment of discrimination into a lesson for everyone. The customer service desk had become an impromptu classroom, with people from all walks of life contributing ideas. Let me share something I learned in combat medicine, Amara said, standing beside Captain Chen. When treating wounds, we don't just patch them up. We find out what caused them to prevent more injuries. The same principle applies here. The airline supervisor had brought out a notepad and was rapidly taking notes. Could you give us an example of what that might look like in practice? Well, Amara began, think about what happened earlier. The upgrade denial wasn't just about one decision. It was about assumptions made before I even reached the counter. She spoke without anger, her voice carrying the same steady tone she used when treating patients under fire. A flight attendant raised her hand. I've noticed sometimes we make quick judgments based on appearance, without even realizing it. Maybe we need training to recognize those moments. Exactly, Captain Chen added. Alexander used to say that awareness is the first step to change. He didn't just teach people how to fly, he taught them how to see things differently. The young woman who had recorded the incident played back some footage. Look here, she pointed out. See how the body language changed once they knew about your father. That's the kind of thing we need to address. Linda watched the video, her face reddening. I never realized how I came across. It's hard to watch. That's good, Amara said gently. Being uncomfortable means you're learning. In the military, we call it growing pains. It has to hurt a little to get better. The elderly veteran wheeled forward. You know what impresses me most? He said, looking around the group. You're not here yelling or demanding punishment. You're teaching, just like your father did. A group of pilots had gathered nearby, listening intently. One stepped forward. The aviation community talks a lot about safety protocols and checklists. Why not create a fairness checklist for customer service decisions? That's brilliant, the supervisor said, writing furiously. Clear steps to follow, removing personal bias from the equation. People started calling out suggestions. Regular staff discussions about unconscious bias. Anonymous feedback system for passengers. Monthly reviews of upgrade patterns. Cultural sensitivity workshops. Amara listened to each idea, adding her own insights from military training about how to build better systems and protocols. The crowd had transformed from angry observers into engaged participants in creating change. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. Mom, is this how things get better? When people talk and learn? His mother nodded, tears in her eyes. Yes, sweetheart. This is exactly how things get better. Captain Chen watched it all with a knowing smile. You know, he said to Amara, your father would do this too. After a long flight, when most pilots would head straight home, He'd stay and talk with the crew about how to make things better. Not just for himself, but for everyone. Mrs. Harrison, who had been quiet for a while, finally spoke up. "I've been doing this job for so long, I thought I knew everything. Today showed me I still have a lot to learn." "We all do," Amara replied warmly. "That's why we're here talking instead of arguing. Change doesn't happen through force. It happens through understanding." The terminal lights had grown brighter as evening settled in, casting a warm glow over the gathering. What had started as a confrontation had become a moment of community, learning, and growth. "Your father changed aviation by showing people a better way," Captain Chen said softly. "And here you are, doing the same thing in your own way." Amara looked around at all the faces, airline staff, passengers, pilots, crew members, all engaged in making real change happen. Sometimes the best way to honor a legacy isn't to accept special treatment, but to ensure that special treatment isn't needed at all. 3 months after that memorable evening in Terminal C, Amara stood at the same counter, but everything was different. The airline had transformed her father's story and her stand for equality into real, lasting change. "Welcome back, Lieutenant." Linda greeted her warmly, but not because of who her father was. This was now standard treatment for all passengers. A large screen behind the counter displayed clear, transparent upgrade policies for everyone to see. Above the counter hung a small plaque that read, "The Wilson Initiative. Excellence through Equality." But it wasn't just a piece of metal on the wall. It represented a complete overhaul of how the airline operated. "You should see the changes," a flight attendant told her excitedly. "We've trained over 2,000 staff members so far. People actually look forward to the sessions because they're based on real stories, including yours." The young woman whose video had gone viral that day was now part of the airline's new passenger advocacy team. "Your story reached millions," she explained, showing Amara her phone. "But the best part? Other airlines started copying the program. It's creating waves across the industry." Captain Chen, who had become a regular face at the training sessions, walked up with a group of new pilots. "Remember how your father used to say that real change happens slowly, like a steady climb to cruising altitude? Well, we're definitely airborne now." A digital dashboard on the wall showed statistics. Upgrade approvals now matched passenger demographics almost perfectly. Customer satisfaction scores had soared. Complaints about discrimination had dropped significantly. "But here's the real success story," the customer service supervisor said, pulling out a folder. "These are letters from passengers. Listen to this one. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen at an airport counter. Not judged by my appearance, but valued as a person." The elderly veteran who had witnessed everything that day was back too, this time with his grandchildren. "I tell him this story," he said proudly, "about how one person's courage to stand up and teach, not fight, changed everything." Mrs. Harrison, who now led sensitivity training sessions, approached Amara with tears in her eyes. "You know what the best part is? We're not just changing policies, we're changing hearts." Staff members come to me sharing their own stories of bias they never realized they carried. The airline had created a scholarship program in Alexander Wilson's name, helping minority students pursue careers in aviation. The first class of recipients was already in flight school, carrying forward his legacy of breaking barriers. "Your father's story is part of our new employee orientation," Linda shared. "But we don't just tell them about his achievements as a pilot. We tell them about his daughter, who taught us that true leadership isn't about taking the easy path. It's about making the path easier for others." A young girl in a pilot's cap tugged at Amara's uniform. "My mom says you helped make things better," she said shyly. "I want to be a pilot too, and now I know I can." Amara knelt down to the girl's level. "You absolutely can. And you know what? You won't have to fight as hard as my father did, because of all these amazing people who are changing things right now." The terminal buzzed with its usual energy, but there was something different in the air. The same counter that had once been a place of discrimination had become a symbol of progress. Captain Chen handed Amara a boarding pass, first class, earned purely on her own merits. "Your father changed aviation by showing people how to fly better," he said. "You changed it by showing people how to be better." As the sun set through the terminal windows, casting long shadows across the floor, Amara looked at the plaque bearing her father's name. She thought about how one moment of standing up for what's right had created ripples of change that would help generations to come. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the greatest honors aren't the ones you receive, but the ones you help others achieve." With that, she picked up her bag and headed toward her gate, leaving behind not just a changed airline, but a changed world, one small corner at a time.